The second part of your Edexcel IGCSE physics syllabus, forces and motion. The second part two consists of force, movement, shape, and momentum, and it's a relatively large chapter than the previous one that we discussed, which was movement and position. These are the syllabus contents which we have just discussed. So starting with forces, what is a force? Anything that moves an object, anything that changes the shape of an object, anything that's changed the speed of an object, anything that changes the object's motion या उसको rest से motion पे लाती है. What is a force? So what do basically forces do? हम कोई भी force लगाते हैं. What does a force do? Now forces can affect bodies in several different ways. For example, number one, they can change their speed. Number two, they can change their direction. And number three, they can also change its shape. So the force has three qualities. अगर आप किसी चीज को push करेंगे, उसकी speed change होगी. If you push a car, you can apply a thrust force, and that engine thrust force can change the engine speed. Car की speed change हो सकती है. Also, if you apply a force in the opposite direction, obviously the direction of the object would also turn towards the opposite direction. So yes, we can say that the forces do change the direction. If there's a ball landing and you provide a sideways force, obviously the ball would turn sideways, either in a left direction or a right direction. Moreover, forces can also change shape. For example, stretching a spring, stretching a rubber band, compressing a spring, compressing an object. What does a force do? You press a rubber, you change its shape. You stretch a spring, you change its shape. You stretch a rubber band, you are still changing the shape. How? By applying a stretching force. Yes, squashing करते हैं. जैसे कि how is it changing? The thrust of an engine can change the car's speed. The gravitational attraction of the sun can also change the direction of the comet. And squashing or stretching a spring can also change its shape. ये हम चीज देख सकते हैं जैसे कि you can see the car. Now the thrust force of the car is changing the speed of the car, is affecting the acceleration of the car as well. Then we have gravitational attraction. Now the gravitational attraction, you'll be studying this in A levels in detail, कि जो circular motion होता है. That circular motion is due to the centripetal force. And where is that centripetal force basically coming from? From the gravitational attraction of the sun that can change the direction of a comet. फिर shape change की बात की, you can see in this diagram that how a load, now this is a load that can be defined as W. ये कोई भी एक weight है that has been applied on the spring. Let's say it's a 5 Newton weight, and this 5 Newton weight on the spring has actually caused it to squash the spring. It has changed the shape. Squash भी हो सकता है, stretch भी हो सकता है, compress भी हो सकता है, elongate भी हो सकता है. Anything can be done only by applying a force. So किस तरह, what are the different forces? Now forces can take many different forms, such as we have air resistance. ठीक है, एक आपके पास हो गई air resistance. Which is also known as the drag force. Very important. Air resistance is the opposite force to the motion of the object. क्या मतलब है? If the object is falling downwards, the air resistance would always act upwards. And what is the thrust force? Thrust force always acts in the direction of the motion of the object. जिस direction में कार जा रही है, उसी direction में आपके पास thrust force लगी है. For example, the one being provided by the engine, for example. फिर हम बात करते हैं compression force की. What is compression? इसको हम squashing भी कह सकते हैं. When you squash a spring, that is compression. You are providing pressure on it. आप pressure provide कर रहे हैं. Pressure से निकले compression. You are compressing the spring. And what are you doing? You are actually changing the shape of the spring. हम यहाँ पे spring की shape भी तो change कर रहे हैं. यहाँ पे thrust क्या कर रहा है? Thrust is changing the acceleration of the car as well. It is also changing the velocity of the car as well. ये आपके पास दोनों scalar vector, दोनों vector quantities हैं, which is being affected by the action of a force. फिर ये ball है. This is a floating ball. Now we have a downward force which is weight, and then we have upward force known as the up thrust. Up thrust जो है ये हमेशा water के through आती है. Water has a specific pressure, और water का pressure भी हमेशा odd रहे. When we'll be doing pressure chapter, ये एक important chapter है, which is the upcoming one in the chapter number 5. उधर हम discuss करेंगे how pressure acts in odd direction, which causes this upward up thrust force on the ball. Now how is the ball floating? क्योंकि इसके ऊपर दोनों equal sized forces हैं. Opposite to the up thrust we have weight, और weight की खास बात ये that weight is such a force that always acts downwards and nowhere else. Weight हमेशा नीचे की तरफ act करेगा due to the gravitational force. Then tension एक और type force है, जैसे कि it can take many forms. Tension क्या होती है? जैसे two people are playing tug of war. Tension क्या है? Tension is acting on this rope. दोनों डायरेक्शन में, this person is putting the rope towards left direction and this person is putting the rope towards the right direction. दोनों के अंदर एक, दोनों ने क्या किया है, they have provided a tension force, a force of tension in the wire, या फिर rope में हो सकती है, या फिर कोई भी pendulum या bobs होंगी, इन सब में आपके पास examples in the Edexcel paper आपके पास आएंगी, which is known as tension, that you provide tension to the wire, that it's being stretched, it's being forced upon, इसके ऊपर pressure apply हो रहा है, इसको हम कहते हैं tension force. वेट की बात करें, फोर्स नंबर 1 वी हैव वेट. वेट क्या है? द नेम गिवन टू द फोर्स ऑफ ग्रेविटी ऑन द मास. अब ये आपके पास अर्थ है. वी नो दैट ग्रेविटी हमेशा डाउनवर्ड्स होती है, तो ऑब्वियसली अ पर्सन स्टैंडिंग हियर उसका वेट डाउनवर्ड होगा, अ पर्सन स्टैंडिंग हियर उसका वेट यहाँ पे होगा, अ पर्सन स्टैंडिंग हियर ऑन द अर्थ उसका वेट यहाँ पे होगा, बट द वेट वुड ऑलवेज एक्ट downwards. Why? Because of the force of gravity that is acting on the person, on the object, on the specific mass. So weight is the name given to the force of gravity on a mass. आपकी अर्थ की gravitational field strength और मून की आपको पता है, ये अर्थ की है 10. In A levels you will be writing 9.8, but overall abhi at Edexcel IGCSE you need to remember that you have to write 10. Then secondly on moon you have to remember it's 1.6. ये आपके पास हो गई अर्थ पे gravitational field strength, and this is the gravitational field strength on moon. So weight is also another word for the force of gravity. जैसे कि अगर मैं कहूँ gravity Fg, Fg क्या है? Fg is known as gravitational force. ये कौन सी force है? G. G force है, which is the gravitational force. Now we know that weight is equal to mg. Weight क्या है? Weight is equal to mg. तो वेट को क्या मैं फोर्स ड्यू टू ग्रेविटेशनल फोर्स कह सकता हूँ, फोर्स ड्यू टू ग्रेविटी कह सकता हूँ. I can write it as Fg. So Fg is equal to mass into gravitational force, and this is how we can calculate weight. If a person's mass is 20 and the gravitational force of Earth is obviously 10, उसका weight क्या हो जाएगा? His weight would be 200 Newton. Remember, the weight is always written in newtons. Weight को हम न्यूटन में लिखते हैं. Why? Why in Newton? Because weight is a force. Weight is a force, and force का unit जो basic होता है, that is known as Newton. Newton था, Isaac Newton was the one who discovered force. और वो force क्या है? Force in this case is your weight. Weight is a force. Mass जो होता है, mass is in kg. So if a person asks you कि आपका weight क्या है, you tell them it's 60 kg. This is wrong. 60 kg is basically your mass. वेट तो वो है जो कि मास के ऊपर ग्रेविटेशनल फोर्स एक्ट करी, एंड दैट गिव्स योर फोर्स. आप अपनी फोर्स तो नहीं बताएंगे, यू आर ऑलवेज गोइंग टू टेल देम योर मास. तो यू हैव नाउ लर्नड अ फार्मूला व्हिच इज W इज इक्वल टू mg. अगर आपको मास कैलकुलेट करने के लिए दिया जाए, व्हाट यू कैन डू इज जस्ट रीराइट द फार्मूला एंड कैलकुलेट बाय m इज इक्वल टू W ओवर g करके आप मास भी निकाल लेंगे, एंड देन यू हैव द सेम फार्मूला फॉर वेट. वेट क्या हो जाएगा? वेट इज इक्वल टू mg. सो यू हैव टू फार्मूलाज टू फाइंड द मास and to also find the weight. Gravitational field strength का जो यूनिट होता है that is Newton per kg. Mass आपका होगा हमेशा kg के अंदर, and the weight would always be given in newtons. Force number 2 is electrostatic force. By the name electro आपको पता लग रहा है, it has something to do with electrostatic fractions, electricity charges. इलेक्ट्रिसिटी की बात होने वाली, इलेक्ट्रॉन्स की बात होगी, नेगेटिव चार्जेस की बात होगी, पॉजिटिव चार्जेस की बात होगी. So what is basically this electrostatic force? I just said we are going to talk about charges. So the force between those charges, the force acting on those charges, the force acted upon by those charges, all of those forces are basically known as the electrostatic forces of attraction or electrostatic force of repulsion. Now we know a basic concept from high school कि वो क्या है? That like charges always repel. And we also know that unlike different charges, they always attract towards each other. So electric force kya hoti hai? The force between two charges. For example, if you're told to draw an electric field, so electric field kya hogi? Remember one thing, that the lines always leave positives and they always arrive at negatives. वो हम आगे भी पढ़ेंगे in the electricity chapter number 2 कि how to draw electric field. Right now you should know that we have two types of electrostatic force. Number 1, electrostatic force of attraction that only takes place between different charges. एक negative हो and the other one should be positive. Secondly, we have the electrostatic force of repulsion when two charges repel. Why do they repel? because they are both the same. दोनों positive होंगे या फिर दोनों negative होंगे. If both are negative and both are positive, they are known as like charges. हम इनको क्या कहते हैं? We call them like charges. ये भी like charges हैं. So there's always a force or repulsion between like charges, whereas this is known as unlike charges. Unlike means different charges. Third force in your syllabus is known as thrust. Thrust मैंने बताया जैसे कि हमने कार इंजन की बात की थी. A forward force. एक forward force हम thrust को ये भी कह सकते हैं that is the forward force. Thrust क्या होगी यहाँ पे? Thrust को हम कहेंगे it is also known as a, ये क्या है आपके पास? It's a forward force. A force pushing an object forward in a forward direction, such as a force from a car engine. A car engine, when you press the accelerator, obviously the engine is going to push your car in the forward direction. Why would it go in the backward direction? आपका जो engine है उसने तो forward force लगानी है. एक rocket हो गया ना. This is a picture I taken from NASA. ये क्या है? एक rocket का thrust कैसे लग रहा है? Obviously in the forward direction, लेकिन उसका सारा thrust act किधर कर रहा है? Right where the engine is actually present. आपका जहां पर रॉकेट का इंजन प्रेजेंट है वहां पे आपका थ्रस्ट एक्ट कर रहा है एंड दैट थ्रस्ट इज बेसिकली प्रोवाइडिंग ए फॉरवर्ड फोर्स. तो उस फॉरवर्ड फोर्स को वी कॉल दी थ्रस्ट. इन दिस केस वो रॉकेट थ्रस्ट होगा. अगर हम एक दूसरी एग्जांपल देखें ऑफ एन एरोप्लेन, अगेन जहां पे आपके पास इंजन प्रेजेंट होगा वहां से निकलेगी एक फोर्स विच इज अगेन दी थ्रस्ट फोर्स. ऑलवेज कहां से डिराइव हो रही है, ये कहां से निकल रही है? वेयर इज इट एक्चुअली अराइजिंग फ्रॉम द इंजन. जैसे कि यहाँ पे प्लेन के इंजन से वो थ्रस्ट फोर्स निकल रही है. रॉकेट का इंजन कहाँ पे होता है? रॉकेट का इंजन यहाँ पे वेयर ऑल द पावर इज बीइंग अप्लाइड. वो जहाँ पे सारी फोर्स अप्लाई हो रही है वहां से फोर्स निकल रही है. इंजन में क्या है? पावर जनरेट होगी. दैट पावर इज गोइंग टू अप्लाई अ फोर्स और वो फोर्स आपकी लगेगी अगेन इन द फॉरवर्ड डायरेक्शन. जो प्लेन का इंजन है दैट इज ऑल्सो गोइंग टू ड्राइव और फ्लाई द प्लेन इन द फॉरवर्ड डायरेक्शन. सेम इज द केस विद रॉकेट. रॉकेट ने ऊपर की तरफ जाना है, फॉरवर्ड फोर्स उसको इन दी अपवर्ड डायरेक्शन ही लेके जाएगी. अगेन वी हैव एन एग्जांपल ऑफ एन एरोप्लेन ओवर हियर. अब एक एरोप्लेन की एग्जांपल बहुत कॉमन है जैसे कि वी हैव सीन इन द प्रीवियस पिक्चर एज वेल. वन थिंग यू नीड टू नो अबाउट दैट व्हाटएवर द ऑब्जेक्ट इज, बेशक वो टिल्टेड है, अगेन यू कैन सी दैट द वेट इज अगेन एक्टिंग डाउनवर्ड्स. हाँ, वेट कहाँ से एक्ट करेगा? दैट डिपेंड्स ऑन द सेंटर ऑफ ग्रेविटी, COG, center of gravity. Every object has a center of gravity. अब center of gravity की एक definition होती है a point where all the weight of the body acts upon. ठीक है? The point at which the weight of the body acts, वो हम आगे भी देखेंगे. तो इस example में हमने देखा that the weight is again acting downwards. Forward direction में जो आपके पास leftwards है वहां पे क्या लग रहा है? Thrust. And opposite to that direction there was one force that we just talked about. वो कौन सी force थी? Air resistance. That force was named air resistance, or in other words it can also be known as the drag force. So drag force क्या होती है? और thrust और drag में क्या फर्क है? Thrust always acts in the direction of the motion of the object. If the object is moving forward, the thrust is going to act in the forward direction. But drag force और air resistance कहाँ act करती है? It's basically the same thing. वो आपको पीछे की तरफ drag करी, वो धकेल रही है. क्यों? Because drag force and air resistance always acts opposite to the motion of the object. अगर object motion forward में है, thrust, if the object has a forward thrust, so the drag would always be in the backward direction. अगर आपके पास object to the left hand side है, तो drag would be towards the right hand side. तो हमेशा opposite to the direction of the motion होगा. Opposite to thrust, that is known as drag force. जैसे कि you can see in this picture. फिर एक lift force आती है. In case of flying objects हम एक lift force की बात करते हैं, that is the upward force. और यही सारी जो forces हैं 1, 2, 3, 4, when they are all equal, they cause the plane to be in the equilibrium position. तो ये देखिए, we have the thrust force in the forward direction, then we have weight due to the gravity always in the downward direction, then we have drag force. Motion किस तरफ था? Motion was towards the right hand side. If the motion was towards the right, then drag force would be acting opposite to the direction. वो क्या होगी? वो होगी left hand side, because the motion was in the right hand side. I told you thrust क्या है? Thrust always acts in the direction of the motion. Drag always acts in opposite to the direction of the motion of the object. And then we have this lift force, that is being upward force provided by the air pressure to the object. और ये सारी force जब equilibrium में होंगी they would keep and balance the object, ना ही वो ऊपर move करेगा ना ही सीधा, it would keep moving at a constant speed. वो अलग बात है that we if increase the thrust and we decrease the drag force, obviously the plane would speed up. If we increase the drag force and decrease the thrust, आपका जो new plane is that is going to be slowed down. Then we have air resistance. Air resistance को भी I just said that is also known as the drag force. Drag force क्या होती है? The friction of the air on a moving object. Drag force कहाँ act करेगी हमेशा? Just a second. The fourth type of force आपकी है air resistance. Now, air resistance is also known as the drag force. Drag force we just discussed, that is the force that acts opposite to the moving object. अगर आपका object downwards है, drag would be upwards. If your object is traveling towards the left, drag would be towards the right. So air resistance को define कैसे करेंगे? This is basically the friction of the air on a moving object. अब friction एक अलग concept of a force. Friction is also a type of drag force. एक आपके पास एयर रेजिस्टेंस है if it's an air medium. अगर आपके surfaces हैं then we'll call the drag force friction. तो drag force की basically आपके पास दो types होती हैं. Whenever we talk about a drag force, it has two types. When we talk about air and when we talk about surfaces. जब बात surfaces की आएगी तो drag force का नाम हो जाएगा friction. Frictional force again acts in the opposite direction of the motion. और अगर बात एयर की आएगी then the force would be your air resistance, again opposite to the direction of the motion. अब here you can see that this parachute is actually falling downwards. ये falling downwards कर तो air resistance over here, the air resistance is actually acting in the upward direction opposite to the motion of the object. अब वो नीचे की तरफ को आ रहा है due to its weight. अब weight जो है, weight is basically acting downward, और weight downward act करता है. And why is the weight acting downwards? Due to the force of gravity of earth. वो gravity है जो कि उसको नीचे की तरफ खींच रही है. अब here we have another example of a parachutist. यहाँ पे आपको नजर आ रहा है that we have air resistance or drag force, और ये आपके पास weight है that is actually acting downwards. Weight की वजह से the object is moving downwards. If the object is moving downwards, the drag force, the air resistance would be acting opposite to the motion. आपको उस weight की वजह से the motion of the object is downwards. Drag force would be opposite. Opposite का मतलब क्या होगा? Down का opposite क्या है? It would be acting upwards, and this is due to your air resistance. Then we have upthrust. Upthrust क्या है? The upthrust होती है in case of always liquids. मोस्ट कॉमनली अगर हम वाटर की एग्जांपल लेते हैं, ओशन हो गया, सी हो गया, स्विमिंग पूल्स हो गए, लिक्विड्स में. अब अपथ्रस्ट क्या है? अपथ्रस्ट इज बेसिकली द फोर्स ऑफ अ फ्लूइड सच एज अ वाटर. यहाँ पे हम फ्लूइड्स के अंदर बात करते हैं where the upthrust is actually present. Now the force of a fluid such as water is pushing an object upwards, making it float. जैसे कि we have submarine. You can see a submarine. अब यहाँ पे नीचे उसके water present है. The water is basically present underneath the submarine, and that water pressure is actually applying an upward force which is known as your upthrust force, and this is due to the water fluid. Water pressure की वजह से वो जो force है that is acting in the upwards direction. Either you can again see another example over here कि यहाँ पे एक ball float कर, अब उस ball का जो weight है that is actually acting in the downward direction. अगर weight downward है तो upthrust we can call it as a drag force as well. लेकिन ये drag force कब applicable है? Not in air, not in surfaces. ये drag force upthrust तब कहलाएगी when we talk about water. तो basically आप एक तरह से याद कर सकते हैं we have three types of drag forces. If we talk about air as a medium, the drag force would be known as air resistance. If we talk about surfaces or solid as a medium, the drag force would be called as frictional force. The third type of drag force is when we talk about water fluids, तब the drag force would be known as your upthrust force. अब upthrust और thrust में फर्क है. Thrust was the previous force, the force number 1 जो हमने discuss की, that is the forward force. जो कि पावर देती है किसी भी चीज को मूव करने के लिए, वो थ्रस्ट है विच ऑलवेज एक्ट्स इन द फॉरवर्ड डायरेक्शन causing the object to move in a constant या in a particular motion, चाहे वो फॉरवर्ड हो, चाहे वो लेफ्टवर्ड्स हो, राइटवर्ड्स हो, आई डोंट केयर, थ्रस्ट है। थ्रस्ट को हम ड्राइविंग फोर्स भी कहते हैं, समथिंग विच ड्राइव द ऑब्जेक्ट। लेकिन थ्रस्ट, up thrust is the drag force being provided by the water, making it float. Up here you can see by the size of the arrows, the size of the arrows are basically the same. ये आपके पास weight भी मौजूद है, ये आपके पास up thrust force भी मौजूद है, and both of these forces up and down are actually constant. अब इन constant की होने की वजह से क्या होता है? They are now letting the ball float. Neither the ball is sinking nor is doing anything. क्या करे? That is remaining in the middle. क्योंकि weight is equal to the up thrust. Weight तो हमेशा downward act करेगा, लेकिन the pressure due to the fluid that is causing a force known as the upthrust force. तो ये क्या है? The force of fluid such as water pushing an object in the upwards direction making it float. तो ये important है, कोई भी object float किस तरह करते हैं, you can now describe it well. Here you can see an example of a famous example of a submarine. दो चीजें बहुत important. One of the examples that we covered in the previous slide also was of an aeroplane. Number two, we have an example of a submarine. अब ये आपके पास एक propelling force है. Propelling force आपकी होगी thrust. Why? Because it is the driving force which is actually driving the submarine in this motion. Motion कहाँ पे है submarine का? Towards the right. Weight आपके पास है, weight always acts downward. Now if the motion is towards the right, water resistance जो है, जो कि आपके पास drag force एक है, क्योंकि water की तरफ से मिलेगी, that would act in the opposite direction which is towards the left. Why towards the left? Because the motion was towards the right. आपका motion right की तरफ था, तो water resistance is a drag force which would always act opposite to the direction of the motion of the object. फिर again upward up thrust आपके पास यहाँ पे आएगा. In the case of aeroplane में क्या था? In the case of aircraft, upward force was known as lift. That is only when the medium is actually your air. यहाँ पे medium आपका water है. When we talk about water, सिर्फ fluids में ये चीज applicable होगी, where the upward force would be known as your upthrust due to water pressure. जो pressure होता है surrounding the water pressure surrounding the submarines, उसकी वजह से upward force लगती है, which is known as the upthrust. Compression is another type of force. Compression क्या है? Forces that are squashing an object. Compression क्या हो जाता है? These are one of the forces which can change the shape of an object. जैसे कि मैंने आपको बताया, spring को आप compress करेंगे, उसके ऊपर pressure देंगे तो क्या होगा? Forces that squash an object. This rubber ball was squashed and look at the shape now. The shape has changed. This is how you compress a spring. आप उसकी shape बदल रहे हैं by pressing it from both sides. You are actually providing the compression force from both the sides. Compression एक ऐसी force है that is always provided from two sides, from one side and to the other side. यहाँ पे भी क्या है? नीचे से भी एक force आ रही है, ऊपर से भी force आ रही है, one side and the second side. तो compression force हमेशा दो sides से act करती है. Only then you can squash and change the shape of an object. जैसे कि this was a normal spring at rest. ये आपके पास अभी इस वक्त spring जो है वो एक normal position के अंदर rest कर रहा है. But when you have applied pressure, या अगर मैं कहूँ कि that's it's not a pressure, it's just a normal force that you have applied, या कोई weight आपने apply किया of a 50 Newton, क्या हुआ है? Compression was applied. मतलब you have squashed the spring in the downward direction, and when you release it, वो spring ज्यादा ऊपर आएगा एकदम से. यही होता है ना, when you press the spring and when you release the compression, finally वो सारी force wave off होती है और आपका spring original position के अंदर वापस आने की कोशिश करता है once you release that compression. Next we have another force जो कि आपके पास है tension. अब tension force में क्या है? Forces that are stretching an object. This force would only arise when an object is being stretched. जब वो object stretch हो रहा होता है उसके अंदर एक force of tension आ जाती है. For example, this is the person B and this is your person A. This is the rope being stretched. So tension is present towards this person as well. Tension is present towards this present person as well. तो टेंशन भी आपके पास कहाँ होगी? जिस तरफ से वो चीज स्ट्रेच हो रही है. लेट्स से इफ दिस वॉल इज बेसिकली स्ट्रेचिंग दिस ब्लॉक, क्योंकि ब्लॉक का जोर तो इधर लग रहा है, तो टेंशन हमेशा उसकी तरफ होगी जहाँ पे प्रेशर पड़ रहा है. द वॉल इज एक्चुअली ट्राइंग नॉट टू लेट द मास विन. ठीक है, वॉल की क्या कोशिश? मास है वो ना जीते, because the mass has a force of weight acting downwards. and this force of the wall is also pulling it upward. तो tension कहाँ है? Tension would always be in the that direction जहाँ से वो pull हो रहा है. टेंशन फोर्स के एक और एग्जांपल वही सेम है, टू पीपल प्लेइंग टग ऑफ वॉर, पर्सन ए एंड वी हैव पर्सन बी. तो उन दोनों में क्या है? देयर इज अ फोर्स ऑफ टेंशन. इधर भी टेंशन है, इधर भी टेंशन है, रिप्रेजेंटेड बाय अ कैपिटल T, and this is when two men are pulling a rope. Reaction force क्या होती है? Reaction force can also be described by Newton's third law. Newton's third law क्या कहता है? That when an object A applies a force on object B would also apply an equal and opposite force on object A. अगर आप wall को push करोगे, wall is going to push you. If you apply an action force on the wall would provide a reaction force against you. If you are applying a force of finger on the wall is also applying a force on your finger. तो आपके पास क्या है? दिस इज योर ऑब्जेक्ट ए एंड दिस इज योर ऑब्जेक्ट बी. ऑब्जेक्ट ए अगर आपको 5 न्यूटन फोर्स लगा के दे रहा है, ऑब्जेक्ट बी वुड आल्सो अप्लाई एन ऑपोजिट फोर्स बट ऑफ द सेम मैग्नीट्यूड. अगर आपका एक्शन जो है वो 10 न्यूटन का था टुवर्ड्स द राइट डायरेक्शन, तो आपके पास रिएक्शन फोर्स भी 10 न्यूटन की ही आएगी बट टुवर्ड्स द लेफ्ट डायरेक्शन. फॉर एग्जांपल ये आपके पास बुक है, बुक का वेट जो है दैट इज एक्टिंग डाउनवर्ड्स, और ये रिएक्शन फोर्स जो है दैट इज एक्टिंग upwards. And this is all for today. आज हमने types of forces discuss कर लिया है and what a force can basically do. Further in the next lecture we'll be talking about vectors and scalar quantities.